sure what time it is. I'm also going to tell you that I am now at the point in my life where I have to print my notes in larger font than I used to. And I forgot to do that yesterday, so a couple times I'm going to have to put on my very fancy glasses here. But I really want to thank the museum for the invitation. It was great to be actually at the museum not too long ago. Thanks, Susan, for deciding to invite me back. If you're disappointed, it's all Susan's fault. I would encourage all of you to come for John in this summer. John McManus, he's awesome, and the tie that binds here among the historians. He's really great. I'm really excited today that most of this project or this program has talked about women, right? As my students say, women are famously half of the population, and yet most of the history doesn't just involve women. And so we have a whole program today about women. World War II opens a lot of doors for American women, right? We've heard about some doors that were open for the 6888 this morning. But I think one of the things we've forgotten in thinking about World War II is how hard those women had to push to do the things they did. And so I want to talk to you today about the very broad topic, American women in World War II. We're going to think about American women in factories, in the military, working with the military abroad. And I want to try to bind all of that together by thinking about how the ideas that Americans had and the expectations Americans had for women in the early 1940s sort of framed how women could participate and created a lot of resistance for those women. And I'm going to start with a clip from a USO show, so it might seem a little odd, but it's a Bob Hope tour. He is about to go on a tour of the South Pacific in 1944. Everybody knows Bob Hope, but the new part of the act is a young woman named Patty Thomas, who has just come on the show, and so this clip is about 1 minute, and that's where I want to start today. All right, can everybody hear that? All right, the joke, some do, I don't, right? That's the key to the whole skit. And Patty Thomas went on this tour, it's Bob Hope, it's typical Bob Hope humor. He's sort of poking fun at himself, he's poking fun at the girl. But this really is the heart of a lot of USO shows. Women are the central part of the show. And they're such a central part of the show is because when you ask most Americans during the war itself what the war was about, they could tell you that the United States was attacked. They could tell you that Hitler was bad, Hitler needed to be stopped. But beyond that, a lot of Americans, especially the young men and women in the war, didn't have a much deeper understanding of the war, right? We all know what it's about. We have the benefit of history. And so there's a lot of effort in the war on the part of the government to provide Americans with the reasons for the war. This is what it's about. Not just here's what we're fighting against, but here's what we're fighting for, right? And so famously the 4 freedoms that come down from the Office of War Information, that was the purpose of the 4 freedoms, was to give Americans something they could sort of put in their pocket and understand this is what this war is all about. But if you ask most GIs, if you ask most Americans in the war what they're fighting for, they say, I want to get home, right? A lot of them would say things like, I'm fighting for mom and apple pie, and reporters would be like, oh, that's crazy, they're not actually fighting for mom and apple pie. But when you really dig down into what they were talking about, they're talking about home. They're fighting to get home. They're fighting for the people beside them, and they're fighting to get home. And for most of them, home meant women, right? It meant mom, it meant your girlfriend, it meant the wife you hope to have, right? It meant getting home to women. right? And so when we think about women in World War II, I try to remind my students, this is what Americans understood. Women were what you fought to get home to. Women were what you were protecting, right? There are a lot of these kinds of advertisements warning that if we don't win the war, your women are in danger, right? We've got to protect them. There's a lot of emphasis as well on you've got to get home to the life you want to have, right? You've got to remember Americans are coming out of the Great Depression right before World War II. And so a lot of these companies are making a lot of money in World War II, emphasizing, if you get home, we win this war, you're going to have community the finest silverware, right? For Americans coming out of the Great Depression, like silverware in and of itself was probably a great thing. Never mind nice silverware and a nice home, but this is what you're aspiring to, right? And so there's a lot of advertisement to women in particular to be the kind of woman that he wants to return to. Right? And all of these beauty advertisements and all of these soap companies and the makeup companies are making hay over this and saying, women, you need to look like the kind of woman he wants to return to. Right? No pressure, ladies. No pressure whatsoever. Women are told to make pinups of themselves to send to their sweethearts, right? We think famously of Betty Grable, right? And we look back on it and it sort of seems innocuous and like, we kind of look through rose-colored glasses and we're like, oh, that's cute, right? But they're also using these images to teach coordinate reading, map reading, and how to, like they're using them in official ways, which is slightly terrifying. I can't imagine a room with like 20-year-old boys learning how to read maps with this kind of stuff, right? But average girls are told from the U.S. government, take pictures of yourself, send them to your boys, right? Give them something to put in their pocket and fight for, right? And it's supposed to be innocent, right? It's supposed to be very cute and very innocent, and that's why the Patty Thomas joke works, and that's why it's essential. She has to say, I'm not that kind of girl, I'm the good girl. I am the good, wholesome American sweetheart that this war is all about, right? That's key, right? But it doesn't take long for even Patty Thomas to realize it's far more complicated than that, right? So she was interviewed after the war, and she said she was very naive. She was very young. She was a tap dancer, and she said that in one of her first shows, she walked out on stage and she saw thousands of men in the audience. And she said, I was just so worried they weren't going to hear the taps on my shoes. And then she's like, it didn't take me long to realize they're not into my tap dancing at all. Like, that is not what they're here for, right? She's really young, and she realizes that pretty quickly, but we don't often ask what that cost her, right? What that meant for her to bear that burden as she's going around trying to do her part to keep up morale, to motivate troops, to represent American home front abroad, to these men and women who haven't been home in years, right? And so that's how Americans understood women's roles. So when we think about American women in the war, right, I asked you, I actually just ruined my entire question here. I was going to be like, okay, so tell me what you think of when you think of American women in factories, and then you're supposed to say, Rosie the Riveter, and I'm supposed to say, what's Rosie look like? And you're like, this one. And I'm like, yes, it's this Rosie. Fun fact, during World War II, Americans, if you ask them what Rosie the Riveter was, outside of one factory in the upper Midwest, and for 2 weeks in February 1942, nobody saw that Rosie, right? In World War II, Rosie was a song, came out in 1942, it was wildly popular, it was remade by a bunch of different groups. That's the song in the very first slide. It's kind of cute, it's a little jazzy 1940 song. They thought of the song, or they thought of Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter on Saturday Evening Post. That was Rosie, right? Any guesses why this isn't the Rosie that we remember today?
They wanted someone prettier.
They wanted someone prettier. This Rosie could take you out, right? This Rosie is not to be messed with, right? I mean, and there's like the art scholars like go into this and just for days can like analyze this, right? She's got her feet on Mein Kampf. She's got her red socks. Like the women in factories weren't even given boots. They weren't given steel-toed boots initially. She's wearing penny loafers, right? She's got a riveting machine. She's got all of her production awards. She's got the mask that goes over her face, right? There's all sorts of things going on here. But that's not the Rosie that makes it into like, popular memory, right? This is the Rosie that makes it into popular memory. Part of it, I mean, a small part, this is not copyrighted, right? This is Office of War Information, produced image. It's free to do with whatever you will, right? And so everybody and their sister has remade this image into whatever they want it to be, right? You can do that. You can go home and put it in Canva right now and make it into a t-shirt. Do whatever you want. But I would suggest that that's not the entire reason, that that's the Rosie we remember instead of this Rosie, right? And so even in our memory now, women in World War II look a certain way, they represent a certain way, and it's not the reality of most women's lives, right? I mean, you guys are interested in history, I assume, which is why you're here today, and so it's probably not a shock to you that the myth and the reality often aren't the same thing. That's probably not news to you. But for women workers, the Norman Rockwell Rosie is far more reflective of their reality if they're in wartime industry. Right? I love this poster of these women. I wouldn't mess with any of them either, just for the record. But even our idea of Rosie the Riveter as working in a wartime factory, there are 2 in 10 women workers during World War II. They're not the majority of women who worked. In the war, about 18 million women worked outside the home. I would suggest all women are working. 18 million of them work outside the home for wages. And that number is a lot for the time, but it's not drastically different than the pre-war numbers. What was different is that the majority of women workers were, for the first time in American history, married women. Right? Initially, single women go to the workforce. Mothers whose children are like old enough they can sort of be trusted to be on their own, they go to the workforce. But the needs for workers continue so drastically that for the first time, married women are the number 1 workers in the workforce among women. And that was a big change, and that was not a change that everybody in America welcomed. Right? Most women who were working, oh, here's another picture. I just love this one. In part because World War II color photographs still kind of weird me out, even though I just think they shouldn't be in color, but they are. But I just love this photo as well. But most women who worked during the war were in clerical work, they were in government jobs, right? All of those jobs that open up in DC, right? With the War Department and just managing the paperwork of a bureaucracy. All of that kind of work, this kind of work, far more common. But when we think of women workers, we like the Rosie the Riveter image, right? We want the image of women sort of busting down the door, doing something that they weren't allowed to do, right? But we really forget it costs those women a lot, right? And one of those women, one of those 18 million, is a woman named Beatrice Morales, who, if I can get to my page here, was a mother of 4 from San Bernardino, California. Right? And she went to work at Lockheed, which before the war had only 5 women workers. But then when the war started, they needed so many more workers, Lockheed opened up to women. And Beatrice wanted one of those jobs. And she said her husband was not thrilled that she had taken the job. She said, when I got home and told my husband, oh, he hit the roof. He was one of those men that didn't believe in the wife ever working. He wanted to be the supporter. And I said, well, I've made up my mind. I'm going to work regardless of whether you like it or not. I was determined. Right? I'm like, well, okay then, husband. You know, like, we might laugh today at our husband and be like, what is up with that? But most married men at that time did not want their wives working. Even in 1943, the nation at large is desperately short for workers, and the Gallup polls showed that 70% of married men did not want their wives working. Right? So we celebrate Rosie, but let's not forget how hard it was for those women to do that. Right? So also remember that when you see all of these kinds of recruitment posters to get women into factories, right? My students always love these because they're like, do women look like that in factories? And I'm like, not any that I've ever seen, right? The posters are designed to tell these women, we need you in the workforce, right? Fill in for him, do the job he left behind, right? Women at work, the sooner we win, right? They're telling Americans it's important, but you can also kind of see what else they're telling Americans here, right? Women who work in factories look like this, right? Their fingernails are painted somehow, their makeup is done, their hair is beautiful, right? There's this implicit message that like it's not going to make them not pretty women, right? They're still going to be women, right? That's the implication here. There's also, particularly for mothers, there's a very concerted effort to say this isn't permanent, right? So you see ads like this, actually like this one because this is from near my hometown in Huntington, West Virginia. Adel Manufacturing, mother, when will you stay home again? And if you could read the small text, it says, some jubilant day this will end and she'll go home, right? It's like, don't worry, only for the duration. And then you see a lot of ads that are specifically not aimed at women. This ad is not aimed at the women in the room. This ad is for the men in the room, right? Telling men, you can be proud of your wife, right? Moms, you can be proud of your daughter, right? My husband wants me to do my part, right? And here's my favorite. They're a real pinup girl, the woman worker, right? We're back to all of those images again, right? So kind of just keep that in mind when you think of all of these women and what they had to deal with and sort of the expectations held for them throughout the war. But regardless of all of that, a lot of women really wanted wartime work in manufacturing jobs in particular. Why? Because they paid the best. Right? If you were a waitress, you made about 20 cents an hour, no tips allowed. If you get a job in a war manufacturing plant, you can make it $1.15. Right? And there were all of these promises that women and men in factories would get the same pay for the same work. That didn't work out like it was promised. But even then, the wages were so great that a lot of these women wanted this work. And it was particularly helpful, and I love this picture because she actually has Rosie on her welding helmet. These kinds of jobs were wanted by everybody, but they were especially desirable for women like Beatrice Morales, for black women who were kept out of the workforce not only because they were women, but because of their race. Right? And there's a famous quote by an African-American woman who says, Hitler was the one who got us out of the white folks' kitchen. Right? If you look at black women, if you look at Mexican-American women, World War II opened doors in ways that it like exponentially. Like the opportunities were just so great, even with all of the resistance. But working outside the home for a lot of these women was still very tough. Right? On Beatrice's first day on the job, one of the men working alongside her told her she wasn't worth her wages. I was like, well, great. First day on the job. People really want me here. It's like, you're not worth any of it. But the quote about her husband should indicate to you that Beatrice was not one to back down. And so she was like, well, all right, then I'm just going to prove you wrong. And so she worked her way up through the factory, and she did a good job throughout the war. But it was still a lot, right? She had this husband who was very protective. She had never really worked around so many men in a factory before, and that was a little unnerving at times. She had to learn her way through the city on a bus, go to work every day. Right? The whole experience was a brand new experience for a lot of these women. Morales worked on P-38s, riveting on P-38s, and worked throughout the war. So at the end of the war, she said she really wanted to stay. And most of the women, about 2/3 of women working in industry, wanted to keep those jobs. But at the end of the war, the American government is very fearful that as the men come home, as the factories shut down, we might fall into another Great Depression. And so the government's main concern was keeping the factories running, right? If we're not making tanks, if we're not making ships anymore, they've got to make something. And so they start making all of the consumer goods that you think of through the late 40s, early 50s, right? And so Women workers, what happens initially, we sort of always think women are pushed out of the workforce in World War II. And to some degree that's true, but only for a little blip. They're forced out of factories. But 2 years after the end of the war, you have more women working than worked in the entire war. Right? The difference was they were now in what were called pink-collar jobs. Right? They're in sales. They're in clerical jobs. They're pushed out of the higher-paying, more secure union jobs of factories and into the less secure, the pink jobs. Right? There are more of them really quickly after the war, but less secure jobs. But nonetheless, sorry, I need the glasses again. Beatrice described herself, she said, before the war, I was just a mother of 4 kids, that's all. But I felt proud of myself and felt good that I could do something, and being it was the war, I felt I was doing my part. Right, so you can see it really, doing her part for the war really had a lasting impact on her and her life. There she is again. Women in the military, women joining the military in World War II is a whole different ballgame. Right? If Americans have a hard time sort of wrapping their heads around women doing new kinds of work, women in the military is even like a step up on the amount of resistance that they're going to face. Nurses were one thing. Nurses for most Americans were fine. Nurses for women in the military, the only women in the military before World War II on a permanent basis were nurses. Right? If you think of like the Hello Girls from World War I or something, they were all contract labor. They were civilians hired by the military. The nurses, they were in the military. But on the morning of Pearl Harbor, there were less than 7,000 Army and Navy nurses around the world. By the end of the war, there were 350,000 women in the military. That's, again, a big number, but the military wanted 1.5 million, right? And they talked about drafting women, right? Kevin mentioned they were all volunteers. There was a lot of discussion like, we're going to have to draft women. That was the talk a few months ago. They never did. Spoiler alert. So they wanted a lot more. Why didn't they get them? Because of all the resistance. Because a lot of Americans had a really hard time thinking of American women as anything other than nurses in the military. But even with nurses, right? Nurses were okay because people thought that's women's work. It was very feminine. Even the advertisements, right? I love this one. Uncle Sam sort of putting the white hat on her head. This is my favorite nurse recruitment ad of all time. Save his life and find your own. Right? You're going to become a nurse. All your patients are going to be heroically handsome. One of them you'll marry. Like, it's going to work out. It's going to be great. Nobody, like, in all of these ads, the wounded never actually look like they're wounded. Like, everybody's clean and in white little linens. Like, I mean, recruitment ads are not actually the truth of the matter. Everybody has a story. My recruiter lied. It's like, yeah, they did. Recruiters, like they're selling you an idea, right? This is an idea. Nurses were okay for the American public, but even then, the idea of nurses being women and this being women's work still limited what they were allowed to do, right? Even as they desperately need nurses, until 1944, nurses were officers, but they had relative rank. They couldn't command men, they didn't get equal pay, it was very limited. Nursing was segregated, right? And the Army allowed black nurses, but only let them treat black patients. The only time they sent them abroad was to treat POWs. They could never treat white patients. The Navy didn't let black women in at all until 1945, and the war is almost over, right? Lots of segregation. There were a lot of men who were nurses in World War II, saying, hey, you desperately need nurses. Let us be nurses. It's like, no. Nurses are women, right? So there's lots of discrimination going on in lots of different ways. But those are nurses, right? Here's some nurses in Sicily. Soldiers, women as soldiers, that is another ballgame entirely, right? For most Americans, that is a bridge too far. 84 years ago, yesterday, I believe, the legislation was passed to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which became the Women's Army Corps, the WAC. World War II opened that door, right? The Army says we actually need women, we desperately need them to do all kinds of work, and it was pitched to the public as free a man to fight, right? Get the women in, they'll do these jobs, and then we'll send the men to combat. For a lot of men, they didn't want to be free to fight. They weren't too thrilled about that, right? A lot of men, especially with men who had families at home, wives, they did not want to go to Tunisia and Sicily and the Pacific, right? They wanted to stay at home. And now all of a sudden, here are these women coming in to take your job so you can be sent to war. And that led to a lot of resistance, right? Not only from men who are now being sent to war, but from their families who are now angry that those men are being sent to war because these women came in and took their jobs, right? And so part of it's a very pragmatic, like, we don't want these women here, we want our men at home, right? Part of it was also that Americans just couldn't understand that women could do all sorts of jobs that they did in the military. There were a lot of people who talked about if women join the military, they'll just become too manly. And then there were a lot of people who on the other side said, well, if they join the military, it must be because they just really want to meet men. And so you've got this like wide spectrum of opposition, right? They either want to meet men or they are too manly. Like it's just, the stereotypes about these women are all over the place. And so again, you see a lot of advertisements trying to convince the public this is all fine. This will be fine. This is patriotic service. This is good work. Be proud of your kids, right? There's a lot of emphasis on that. Again, all these women are just gorgeous, right? With their hair and their lipstick and all of these things. What else do you notice about all of these advertisements and these women?
They're white.
They're all white, right? Absolutely, they are all white. Despite African American women, right? It's a group of Nisei Women's Army Corps. Women who, in many cases, had been in internment camps before they were in the Army. Like, holy smokes, right? Like, yeah, we want to serve too. We want to help this war. One of these women is a woman from Texas, from Ellinger, Texas. I've been here a decade, but I'm still learning Texas geography because Texas is the size of like 18 countries. It's somewhere in the south between like San Antonio and Houston, right? So Kitty was 18 to 19 years old when she moved to San Antonio to work in doing housework for a physician. But she really wanted to do something for the war. She was working at a defense, she left the home, worked in the home, and she worked at a defense plant, but she really wanted to do something else. And in particular, she said, and this is what a lot of women said actually, she wanted to join the Navy because everybody hated the WAC uniforms. They were essentially men's uniforms, sort of adjusted and made a little bit smaller for women's bodies, but nobody liked them. They didn't look good on anybody. The Navy actually got somebody to design uniforms for women's bodies, and they were nice uniforms. All the women wanted those uniforms. So like, I got to join the service, I'm going Navy. But Kitty was 20 years old. And for women, you had to be 21, right? Men could join at 18. She had to get her parents' signature to join the Navy. She joins the Navy, and the Navy held its training for women at Hunter College in the Bronx in New York. They held it on a college campus intentionally because they wanted to give it like an air of respectability. They wanted it to seem elite, right? And so they sent all of the waves. Women in the Navy were in the waves. It's the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, which also is a word that, or a phrase that sort of indicates its temporary nature, emergency service, right? But she gets on a train to go to New York, and it's the first time she's been on a train, and it's the first time she left Texas. And she said she loved meeting all of these women from all over the country. She was a little astonished that some of the women cursed. That was an eye-opener for her. But she said that when they all heard she was from Texas, they thought that she owned a ranch. She's like, I don't own a ranch. But she loved the experience. She was sent to the Naval Air Station Dallas in Bunker Hill, Indiana. My Indiana people back here. And she worked as an aviation machinist mate. She performed light instrument repair work. And she actually met the man she would later marry at a USO dance. At the end of the war training, and became a pilot. And as of a little over a year ago, she turned 101. And ironically enough, these are sailors from the USS Fort Worth, which is stationed in San Diego. And they brought her a birthday cake to celebrate her birthday. Right, so some of these women still around, not too many of them anymore. But if we go back to where we started with the Patty Thomas and the USO show, this is one of my favorite pictures of all of the work I've ever done. Like, you couldn't stage this any better. These are Red Cross volunteers, and they're on a little boat bringing donuts to men who are building a pontoon bridge. It's just gorgeous. I love this photo. Let's look back at the women who their whole job was to entertain the troops, right? And most of these women, if I had asked most of you, I'm like spoiling my whole questions and the surprise. But if I had asked most of you before, like, tell me about women in the USO, it's probably somebody famous, right? Like Marlene Dietrich, some woman who was famous. But the vast majority of women in the USO and in the Red Cross were just ordinary women. Nobody had ever heard of them, right? They were just ordinary women in their early 20s. Most of them in the Red Cross had been to college, so they're even a little bit older. But they wanted to do something, right? They wanted to do something for the war effort. And so the Red Cross sent women to clubs all around the world. They were in every theater. They were all over the place. They were in China, Burma, India. They were in the South Pacific. They were everywhere. They served coffee and donuts. They took Jeeps, and they even converted some London double-decker buses, and they made them clubmobiles, and they would put coffee and donut machines on them, and they would drive them around. So if the troops couldn't get back to a base, they would take the clubmobile out and go meet the guys wherever they were. USO traveled everywhere, right? These are ordinary girls. Now, who had the brilliant idea to send young women to go serve coffee and donuts to soldiers? Seems like a strange idea maybe to us at the time, but at the time, it came out of World War I when some progressive era military officials, very optimistic, thought, we need to keep the boys from getting into trouble. Right? In World War I, they would talk about going to Paris. In World War II, they're going to Piccadilly Circus. We know where we're going. They want to keep the boys from getting into trouble. Okay? Some very optimistic folks said the way we do that is send them American Girls with Donuts. It'll be fine. Well, in World War I, they realized it was not fine. It didn't quite keep the boys out of trouble. The boys got into a lot of trouble. And it's funny, too, they're always boys, right? They're men when we need them to be men. But in this case, they're all boys, right? We gotta keep the boys out of trouble. It doesn't work the way they think it's gonna work, but by World War II, I mean, from FDR to Eisenhower, all of them, they're all begging for American women, right? And part of it, they've kind of given up on it'll keep them out of trouble. But you have to remember in World War I, when it starts, your enlistment was for the duration plus 6 months. Nobody knows how long that's going to last, right? You're not coming home for who knows how long. And a lot of American families are worried about their sons, most of whom are drafted, and who are being sent somewhere far away, right? They're especially worried about sons who get sent to the Pacific because it seems so far away and so foreign to them, right? And so their hope is that if we send these girls, it's going to remind them of home. It's going to remind them of what they're fighting for, right? It's going to keep them from behaving like a bunch of heathens, maybe, maybe, not always, right? But it's going to give them something positive, right? It's going to remind them of a normal life. Because they were concerned a lot about, at the end of the war, are all of these men who've been in a military environment for 3-4 years, however long, are they going to be able to come back into civilian society? And so a lot of this thought is we need to keep normal influences around them, right? And so this This is the rationale, right? But they're young women from home. Again, you'll notice in most of these pictures, these are white women. There were the Red Cross and the USO both said, we don't segregate. And yet they did. And so there are some submobile units of black women, some USO troops, right? Angelina Horn did a lot of USO travel, but it's still very much a segregated kind of entertainment. Now, one of these women is a woman named Elizabeth Richardson, who was from Mishawaka, Indiana. Again, it's a theme today, Indiana. She had gone to college at an all-women's school named Dower College and was an art major. And so she got a job after college drawing advertisements for newspapers for a department store. And when the war started, she went to the USO and she volunteered, but she really wanted to go to the war. She wanted to be in it. And it might seem ironic, but if you were a woman who wanted to go to a war zone, the only organization that would guarantee you an assignment in the war was the Red Cross. Not the military, the Red Cross. So she joined the Red Cross. So she joins the Red Cross, she goes to American University in DC for training, and the training basically involved learning the Major League Baseball teams, learning how to play ping pong, another theme. Like, they're learning how to, like, have fun in the club with the guys, right? They're learning how to talk their talk, right? You gotta know the Major League teams to be able to have a conversation. You have to learn how to dance, right? You have to learn all of these social things. But what women like Elizabeth learned, she's sent to work the base camp for the 82nd Airborne in Leicester, England, right? And so she is over there serving coffee and donuts. The 82nd has been brought back from the Battle of the Bulge to Leicester, England by the time she gets there. And she realizes very quickly that most of her job is grief counseling, right? What they want is to come talk to a woman and just unload, right? Just have a conversation. Not an ounce of her training taught her how to be a counselor, right? And so she's also far from home. She's also in a war zone. She's doing all of these things and also trying to figure out how to deal with all of this attention, right? A lot of these women talked about their life as being in a goldfish bowl, right? I mean, you can imagine, like, she wrote to one of her friends, she says, it's not my fatal beauty that attracts these men. She's like, it's not the coffee, it's not the donuts, it's not me. She said something like, I'm a victim of non-fraternization. Like, I'm the best game around, basically. So they're gonna come to me, right? But she can never hide, right? None of these Red Cross women can ever hide. They can never say, you know what, you're the 75th boy I've talked to this morning. I just need a break. Can never do that. Your whole job is to be there to make every single one of those 75 boys feel like they are the center of the universe and to let them have a moment away from war. Nobody ever thought what it would cost Elizabeth Richardson or any of the other women to do that with. Nobody's worried about their morale. Nobody's worried about their mental health, right? They're just there to do that job, right? And so a lot of these women talk about how they try to sort of build a wall around them to protect themselves, right? They're also learning who these men are. They're getting to be friends with them. These friends then get sent back to war, and some of them don't come home, right? And so they're dealing with their own grief, their own emotions, all of that. And despite how hard she tried, Elizabeth met a nice first lieutenant named Larry. And she wrote her parents, she had this great quote. Let me make sure I read it because he couldn't write this any better. Hang on, she said something like, I can't, this is why I need 16-point font. She said that she could imagine under happier circumstances and in better years, I can imagine nothing better than burning the toast for him. Right? But she knew that, like, it's war and it's probably not going to last. And so they kind of broke it off, but she still pined away for him. And Larry was sent with the 82nd back to Germany. And not long after he arrived, she learned he was missing in action. Right? But in a reversal of the typical wartime story, Larry came home and Elizabeth did not. Elizabeth, all of these Red Cross women were forbidden from flying, but they did it anyway. She had to go to a meeting in Paris, so she hopped on a plane in July 25th, 1945, the war's over. She hopped on a plane to go to a meeting in Paris, and it crashed immediately. She was buried initially in Évreux, France, and then 3 years later, her parents made the decision to leave her at the Normandy American Cemetery, where she's one of 4 American women alongside 3 women from the 688. Right? She's one of 72 Red Cross women who died in World War II. Right? And so, we think of all of these women doing all of these amazing things, and we sometimes forget it had a very real cost for them. Right? So when we think about all of those women, right, think about, narrow it down, like this is actually about individual women, right? It's about individual women like Beatrice Morales and Kitty and Elizabeth. And the war opened up possibilities for them. It opened up all sorts of doors. But it also faced a lot of resistance and a lot of hardship as they did that. And the World War II Museum has a tagline. It's something like, ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. And I think sometimes what was extraordinary was doing the very ordinary things that these women did. Just doing the job they were supposed to do, in spite of all odds and in spite of a lot of resistance. And I think when we remember them, it might help us celebrate them even more by remembering that they were up against a lot of resistance when they did this. Everybody wasn't patting them on the back at the time, and they did it anyway. And I think that makes them even more amazing for what they did. So, that is, in a nutshell, American women in World War II, half the population. What questions does everybody have?
Susan, here's Kevin.
Oh, now it's coming back at me.
Yeah, my revenge. I'm just curious, the women going into the factories, did they face any, I guess, like, I would almost call it institutional prejudice, like maybe they didn't have ladies' rooms or uniforms or anything like that?
All of the above, yes. Yeah, and part of it, there's an element of we're just not prepared for this. So there is absolutely an element of prejudice on the part of male workers who, remember, who are coming out of the Great Depression and are happy to have jobs now and are terrified that if women come into the factories, the employers are going to use that as an excuse to lower all of their wages because you could pay women half, right? And so they are partly, it makes sense. They're terrified their wages are going to be cut, right? So there's partly that kind of actual prejudice, but then there's also, even if they're we want all women, come on, they still don't know what to do with them. They don't have the proper safety equipment, they don't have restrooms, they don't know, they just don't know. They don't know what they don't know, right? And these are also women, again, married women, a lot of mothers. They just don't know how mothers' needs in a day differ from fathers who don't have the same, in the 40s, child care responsibilities, right? So these women have to get their kids to school, they have to pick them up at school, they've got to go do the shopping with rationing, they got to go find the meat. It's just a whole thing that's different for women, and they just don't know what they don't know, even in the best of circumstances.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah.
You said near the beginning of your presentation that the difference in percentage of women in the workforce in the Depression era versus in the World War II era wasn't as significant as we would think. Do you know what that percentage difference was?
About 36% of the workforce in World War II was women. I have the numbers somewhere, not on the pages that I can't read, even with my glasses apparently. It went up, but not, I think in our popular memory, the narrative is hardly any women at all worked outside the home. And then World War II happens, it's boom. It's not that drastic. It's not that drastic. It's a jump, but it's not that much. But about 36% of workers were women.
My mother was one of the 300,000 in Washington, D.C.
Huh?
I've just got through reading Michael Parody's book on Eisenhower, and one of Eisenhower's biggest problems was they gave condoms out to the soldiers in London, and they just threw the used condoms everywhere, that he was having a problem. But what about the pregnancy rate of these women? Did they have a problem?
So that was the fear, right? The military was terrified of that. And the military, like when I say the military, like the Eisenhowers, but also the women in charge of the women's corps, because they knew if that started happening, it would undermine all of it. That everybody would say, well, look, that's what we told you would happen, right? And it wasn't that much, right? All of the disciplinary rates, pregnancy rates, like all of those things for women were like way down here compared to like boys being boys kinds of stuff, right? It wasn't that much. And actually, one of the things that really surprised me, going into the archives, I would have told you, if a woman in the WAC gets pregnant, they're just gonna like be angry and they're gonna treat her like dirt. And actually what I found was they didn't. And there's a lot, it still shocks me. Like the way they talked about it, you would see these very older women who were terrified about protecting the reputation of these women. And one of these women would get pregnant and she would just be like, you know what? It is war and life is short and everybody's searching for meaning and like nobody's blaming these boys out here doing all of these other things, but now we're just focused on the woman who gets pregnant, right? And that was surprising to me. Like they were empathetic and they would get these women home, get them into places where they could get care. They were worried about their medical treatment. Like, I'm not saying it would, like today we would look at it and be like, oh, great, y'all got this like in hand. Like, we'd probably be like, oh, well, you should do things a little differently now. But for that time and what I expected them to say about those women, they did a far better job than I expected. I was really surprised. Yeah.
Bob Hope made these tours through all the wars. Have you ever had any contact or interviewed any of the showgirls that he had on his tours? Whether it be World War II, Korea, or Vietnam.
So in Vietnam, the women were called the gold diggers. Like, you can't make this up, all right? Like, the gold diggers, come on. I have never had the opportunity to meet those women on that tour, but I've met other women who toured with the USF, right, the ordinary women. Some of those women I got to interview for the book on entertainment. Yeah, and it, yeah.
I was 12 years old in 1945. Lived in a farm in the Quincy, Illinois area. And I remember many times if we could keep our radio working, that the early part of the war was very scary for us.
Yeah.
Because it was not going well the first 2 years of the war.
Yeah.
I can remember that well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, could you recap the names of all three women you had up there?
Yes.
Just so that everyone has it down, and I've got 2 out of the 3.
Yes. So that's Beatrice Morales. She's from San Bernardino, California. And that's Kitty Rippin, R-I-P-P-I-N. And Elizabeth Richardson. She was from Indiana. There's a great book, actually a professor of mine wrote, makes me feel really old, but a professor of mine knew her brother, and he had kept all of her diaries and letters and everything. So it's called Slinging Donuts for the Boys. And it's partly him like explaining what she was doing, and then it's partly her diary and letters. Yeah, it's very cool. Like, because, I mean, that's kind of what I was saying to Kevin earlier. Like, a lot of these women, they write letters home, and then as soon as the war's over, there are no more letters. Family gets rid of letters. Women are so hard to find. Beatrice Morales, if she gets married, she likely changes her name. Like, women are hard to find in history. And so when you get something like a stash of letters and diaries of Elizabeth Richardson, it is a gold mine.
Kitty is originally from where?
Ellisview, Texas.
Oh, that's right, she's the one.
Yeah.
I looked at that, there's in between Austin and Houston.
Somewhere down there.